Now that we have configured our local development environment to be really self-contained, let's look at how we can use it for the automations. And one of the easiest ways to get started with automations is, especially if you have a GitHub access and a GitHub account, is the GitHub Actions. So it's basically a computer in the cloud and you can do anything with it. In our instance, we want to use it for running the tests. So what we can do is introduce a GitHub action that basically does this for us automatically in this cloud. Whenever somebody commits some code or opens a pull request, this automated check is going to verify, run some certain steps that then can give us the confidence that this is indeed happening. And the way the GitHub Actions work is they use custom YAML files. Hooray! Another YAML file. So we had Docker Compose YAML file, we had the WP CLI YAML file for the configuration. Now we have another one that needs to be added to our repository. And then as you can see here, within that file, we're going to be defining all the steps that it's going to go through to eventually run the test. In our case, the test is listing the plugins. We want to be using the WP CLI that is available in our environment to list the plugins and see that our custom plugin that we've written, at least the boilerplate that we have right now, is available for this application. So that's great. It means that nobody has removed the directory or changed its name or whatever. We can basically run this, and if this step passes, then we get this listing as expected. So let's look at that custom YAML file that we need to add to our repository. So the way GitHub does this is through this magical .github directory. And with that one, we need to have a folder called workflows, and then we can have arbitrary YAML files in there. And that YAML file has a specific structure. So it has a syntax that it needs to follow. I've added a link to it here from the top. If you use command click or control click, probably on Windows, you can access this directly. And this gives you the information on what is the format of this that needs to be followed for the GitHub action to work. It basically gives you an option to say, okay, run this task only on specific branches, and then kind of give you the actual job description, right? So these are the steps here. So this is where we're actually doing the step. We're saying on which virtual environment we're going to be running this, and then the individual steps. So let's go through them one by one. So this file is called test. It's a generic one that we'll be expanding later on. The idea is we want it to run on any push. So anytime somebody commits to this repository, we want to run this test so that they get the answer of something is failing now as soon as possible during their development cycle. Then we're going to say we need just one job that's called test. And then we're going to use these helper actions. Some of them are contributed by GitHub itself, but a lot of them are available from the community. In our case, we need to check out the repository, right? The current branch that happens by default if you use this action. Then we're going to set up the Node.js. And for that, we can actually use a file called nvmrc. This is the file that we saw on the GitHub repository used to define the version of Node that is required for this project. So here we've said, okay, Node 20 is what we need. And by using this action here, that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to install the version of Node 20 and also implement some caching for the modules that are needed there. And then everything else is based on our custom commands that we've written. The nice thing is that these are the same npm scripts that we're using on our local machine. So remember, npm run start, right? So that's going to build a Docker container and actually start all the containers there. Then there is some steps here we're going to be talking about a bit later on. But here the familiar things is like npm run CLI composer install. So we're going to install all the composer dependencies. Then we're going to set up WordPress. Remember, so we need to install this. And then the final step is npm run wp plugin list. This is just an example, but you can see here how the same commands that we're using locally for development are also used in this GitHub action. So that is the benefit of having this self-contained local development environment. You could not use local WP in this manner. It would simply not be possible. You can use some of this with the WP env, but the configuration for this is a bit more extensive. Next, let's look at these two additional steps. As I mentioned earlier, the startup sequence of the MySQL container is actually a bit involved. So without this step, without the waiting for the database to be fully provisioned, this GitHub action is gonna start and run into an issue that the database is not present. So the same red error message saying cannot connect to the database. So we need to do the following thing is we need to wait for the MySQL service to be present and responding. And we can do that by introducing another helper utility into our local development environment. So if we go back to our Docker file, we can see here that I've added another step here, which basically pulls it down from GitHub. It's a bash script that is called wait for. So that's all it does. It is able to wait for a TCP connection to become available. And since our database is available over TCP, it's another container running there, similar to most production setups, then we can use this utility in this sequence of the actions to wait for the MySQL container on this port to become available. So once we do this, now we will be able to run the WP core install. Now, what about this other step here? So here we're saying docker compose run WP, so run this inside the WP container, and then we're saying ch own recursively WP data, so for this directory. What this does is that it makes the owner of this directory, the var www.html, be this user. And this is required for the Docker environment to be able to install the Composer dependencies. The problem here is that Docker Compose, by default, for all these volume maps that you see here, so this is our WP container, so this volume map, when it's taking essentially the contents of our project root directory and placing it inside that container, when it does that, it makes the destination owned by the root user. And in this case, when we're not running the CLI command, but when we're just purely starting the container, the runner is actually root. So that's what happens here on GitHub Actions. And you might actually see this happen on your machine as well. So then we need to adjust for this directory to be owned by the www.data user. And then when that's the case, now this npm run CLI script that we introduced, which uses that www.data user, will be able now to do all the elements here. So that's the gist of it. Now we can look through the steps. We can also obviously run them locally. It's going to be the same exact sequence of events, which is another important benefit of this approach, is that you can replicate all of these steps that we're doing here in this virtualized machine, this GitHub action, also on the local. So we can say, okay, npm run start. We could actually have, let me just stop this again so we can actually see it waiting for this. So I'm going to say npm stop. And then we're going to do this. Actually, I'm now thinking we can probably just make it npm run CLI, right? And that should be it. So you see, it's waiting for the database. When it's done, the database should be present. Now, changing the ownership, this is something that requires that root level. So this is why we're not using npm run CLI, because changing this, running this change owner is not available to this www user, right? It makes sense. So we can run this. We can also check actually what the permissions eventually are. So we can say npm run CLI bash to start that terminal. And then I'm going to do ls for listing this, list all, and in human readable format. And then you can see here that the root directory, right, this dot here, is owned by the www data now. So that's great. Now as part of the last step here, we're running Composer install. Well, not inside the container. Okay. Oh, it's actually complaining there is no unzip command. Okay, that's another improvement we can do. So as part of the Docker file, here we need to install not only the curl that we needed, not only the SMTP client, but also unzip, right? So we can say here, we're going to add a comment saying for Composer and probably WP CLI as well. So that's great. Now we have these two things. What's the final test that we're running? We're installing core. So this should have already happened. Okay. And then finally, we're listing those plugins. There we go. So let's go back. We have committed these changes. If we go back to our GitHub action, then we can see it passed through all these steps. So it did the checkout of the repository. It also tells you how much time it spent on that. Afterwards, it set up the Node.js at this specific version. This is great. It only takes a second. Then starting up the environment. So this is doing exactly what we did on local. It's saying Docker Compose up, and it's going to build that image using the base layers that we're basing our image on. Then you see it's installing the packages that we need, and that's it. And afterwards, when it's done, we're saying install dependencies. So we're now running the npm run CLI composer install inside that virtual development environment that we have, the Docker one. And that's already done. And then afterwards, we're saying set up WordPress, success, WordPress installed successfully. And here we're listing the plugins. Let's look at the error that would have happened if we did not add the wait for utility in here. So it's part of the previous actions here. So here we can see that during the setup WordPress, it literally says error establishing the database connection. So this is the generic error. This is one of the most popular errors that you might be seeing. So you need to be able to debug this. And one of the easiest ways to do it is look at the logs from the containers. And if you see the MySQL container saying it's ready to accept the connections, so let's go npm run logs. You can see all these latest messages were from the MySQL. At the end here, it says MySQL D ready for connections. So if this has not happened, you can trace it all back and see what the actual error is. So this is really handy. So that's how easy it is to set up a GitHub action. All you have to do is add a file to the GitHub directory within your project under the workflows folder. You can name it as you want. You need to follow this specification of that syntax. And then you can check the results of that under this Actions tab in your repository. Also, if this was a pull request that I had created, let's look at the one that I used for this module 4. We can see the status of those runs, the success or error being displayed in line. So you can see here that this was still failing before I added that wait for utility. There are multiple ways to do it. So this is where it's still failing. And after I fixed it by introducing the wait for, it began working, and that's identified by this green checkbox. So you can see how we can extend this in future to not only run this, but also unit tests for PHP and end-to-end tests for our blocks. All the things, great things that are required for really good quality development experience, but also for kind of the quality product that we're building with WordPress.